south to Nashville, Tennessee by car. We decided we would break the drive midway in Abingdon, Virginia. I looked online and the Martha Washington Inn came up again and again. I looked at the website and it seemed very charming, historical and comfortable. I booked it. The evening before we left, I decided to do a little more research on the town and its history, starting with the Martha Washington Inn. The inn had been built in the late 1700s by a wealthy military man for his wife and 9 children. It later became a college for women and was named after Martha Washington. During the Civil War, it became a hospital and some of the female students stayed on and were put to work as nurses. It was during this time that a wounded Union soldier was smuggled in by way of underground passages and housed in one of the rooms overlooking the garden. He was nursed by a young woman who used music to soothe his suffering and calm his spirits. The Union captain lingered some time in his mortally wounded state, but was tenderly nursed by Elizabeth. The young girl stayed by his side day and night until he took his final breath. It is said the two fell in love during this time, and today guests have declared they hear violin music playing in room 217, where he is said to have died. Being Irish, I have grown up with stories of the supernatural, so this story didn't really concern me too much, but I was surprised when we were handed the key to room 217 when we checked in the following day. My friend and I decided not to change rooms and promptly made our way down the hallway to the room. It was garden level and comfortable, nicely appointed with a pleasant decor. Nothing about the room would suggest anything otherworldly. As we moved through the doorway, we noticed that the small entrance hallway led to an alcove that housed a sink and vanity, and beyond that a bathroom. The bedroom faced us. As my friend moved through the door, she called to me and asked me to come back and check out a shadow that was silhouetted across the exterior of the entrance to the room. I did so, but didn't see the shadow. We went outside and looked about to see if the shadow may have been caused by someone going to another room. There was no one there, but as we stood there trying to figure out where the figure may have gone, we heard a woman cough. We couldn't determine where the cough was coming from and dismissed it coming from another room somewhere along the hallway. We chided each other on our imaginations getting the best of us and settled in. We got ready and made our way out to the town for some exploration and decided to walk up to the tavern for an early supper. The tavern is the oldest building in Abingdon and was built in 1777, a year after America declared its independence from Britain. We had a decent dinner and a bottle of wine. The restaurant is definitely worth a visit, and the staff are very pleasant and offered to show us the attics where during the war between the North and South there was a field hospital. We left and came back to the inn and had a small glass of port before heading to bed. We had a long drive ahead of us the next day and wanted to sleep early. We spoke to our friends in Nashville and told them we planned to be there late afternoon and would leave first thing in the morning. After falling asleep at about 10, I woke up feeling very, very cold. I was also very groggy with sleep, and instead of getting up to turn on the heat, I just pulled the duvet up closer and grabbed a pillow around my body to create warmth. I fell back asleep and had a nightmare. I woke up again at 2:45 and noticed my friend was also awake in the other bed. I asked her if she was okay, and she said she had woken up freezing cold and couldn't get back to sleep again. I started to tell her about the dream when I noticed in the semi-darkness we had left a light on in the bathroom that there was something draped over her bed and billowed between the distance from her bed to mine and was also covering my bed. I sat up and couldn't quite make it out. It looked like wide white ribbons or bandages, but as I looked closer, it turned out to be toilet paper. Now, as I mentioned before, the bathroom where the toilet was located was some distance from the bedroom and was accessed via the hall and the anteroom where the sink and vanity were. It would have been quite a feat to pull the paper from the toilet roll holder and to spool it across the 3 spaces without breaking or twisting, and in fact in order to do this would have had to have been removed from the spool and then put back on the holder. The other disconcerting thing was that it covered my upper torso over the bed covers and was neatly tucked in behind me. It was unbroken and only tore off when I sat up. There was a thickness in the room, and we both had headaches, and my friend was finding it a little difficult to breathe. After some time, we decided it was better to try and sleep and calm our fears, so we did so, and after a few fitful hours, woke to the sun rising outside our garden window. We both still complained of a heavy head and quickly got dressed and went downstairs to breakfast. We mentioned to the staff what had occurred, and they were not that surprised. One member related stories from the previous week of a businessman who had a much more frightening experience, which left him very shaken and swearing never to return. Another was a nurse traveling to see her family who woke up with the sensation of her ankles being tugged. The same happened to a Japanese businessman traveling with his boss. He changed rooms, but the nurse decided to check out. Upon relating our story, another guest said that there was supposedly a little girl who had been seen in the corridor of the inn and had reported drowning in a creek when she was 6 years old. We believe that it may have been her spirit who visited that evening, as it seemed like a childish gesture. Our headaches returned again when we went to pack our bags, and once again dissipated when we left the room. I am sure we experienced a haunting, and when I went to check my toiletries, noticed that my creams and some of my lotion had been reduced by half. Seems like maybe a little girl may have been playing with our perfumes and potions that evening as well.
In 1914, the Newfoundland sailed up to the ice with a crew of 250 men. On March 30th, 77 men went out on the ice to kill seals. A mighty storm came up while the men were out. That lasted 2 days, and the men could not make it back to the ship. When the storm ceased, other ships came and helped the crew of the Newfoundland search for the missing men. 72 were found dead, and 5 were missing, presumed drowned. The ship sailed home in sorrow, and didn't go to the ice at all the next year. She was considered to be unlucky. To break the curse, the ship was rebuilt and changed so that she would drown no more men. Her new name was the San Blanford, and she was sent to the ice 2 years after the terrible storm. On the 30th of March, she met up with another ship called the Terra Nova. As dusk fell, a fog rolled in, and the crew of the San Blanford heard the Terra Nova blowing her whistle. This was a signal that she still had men out on the ice. As was customary, the crew of the San Blanford started blowing their whistle, and those above deck could hear voices calling out from the ice, and presumed they belonged to the sailors from the Terra Nova. The 2 ships kept up their signals until 10 p.m., when the voices ceased, and all were presumed safely aboard ship. The next morning, a sailor from the San Blanford boarded the Terra Nova to conduct some business. The captain of the ship immediately asked the sailor what time the members of the San Blanford crew had gotten aboard the previous night. The sailor was puzzled.
"We didn't have anyone out on the ice, sir."
But the captain and his crew swore that they had seen 5 men board the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. When the sailor returned to the San Blanford, he reported the incident to his captain. The captain took him quietly aside and told him that the report was true. A few members of the night crew had seen 5 men climb aboard the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. The men were wearing tattered clothing that looked as if it had been ripped and worn out by the waves of the sea, and the crew could see right through their shining bodies. One of the sailors on duty that evening had been on the Newfoundland when she lost the 77 men 2 years ago that very night. He had recognized the faces of the ghosts as those belonging to the 5 men who were presumed drowned. Their spirits had finally returned to the ship from which they had been lost, and could now rest in peace.
A couple of my friends and I decided to go on a legend trip to the Bridgewater Triangle last March. We went to Lizzie Borden's house, and on the way home we decided to stop at Dighton Rock State Park. Now, before I go any further, let me stop and explain some things. Firstly, I'm a sensitive or psychic person, I suppose. I can sense, feel, hear, and sometimes see ghosts and other entities. This story revolves a lot around those abilities. Secondly, I just want to go over some of the history of the Bridgewater Triangle for those of you who don't know much about it. So the Bridgewater Triangle is an area in Massachusetts that is known for having some weird-ass occurrences, such as UFO sightings, cryptid sightings such as Bigfoot and Thunderbirds, superfluous demon worship, and a very large amount of hauntings. It is called as such because it is a triangle formed by the towns of Rehoboth, Abington, and Freeton, with the town of Bridgewater right in the middle. One of the most notable areas in the triangle is the Hockomock Swamp. It is notable not only because the area has arguably the most paranormal sightings in the triangle, some of which go back to the Pilgrims, but has also played a huge part in King Philip's War when it was used as a base for Metacomet, King Philip, to launch attacks on nearby settlements. The swamp was called Hockomock by the Wampanoag tribe of the Algonquin Nation. The name means place where spirits dwell. The settlers aptly named it Devil's Swamp. Our first stop that day was the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast in Fall River, Massachusetts. Fall River is slightly outside of the triangle, but the energy certainly bleeds outside of the area of the main triangle. I had been to the bed and breakfast before and slept over, so I knew what to expect from the spirits there. None of the people I was with had been there before. When we walked in for the tour, we were seated in the small parlor to wait for anyone else who may be running late. I sat in the chair closest to the doorway to the living room where Mr. Borden's body was initially found in the past. Now, Mr. Borden generally doesn't like people in his house, so when we sat down, I felt him come over from where he was sitting on the couch and stand in the doorway, watching us. When the tour guide started giving her speech, he walked away and sat back down on the couch, seemingly bored with us. After we were done in the parlor, we went into the dining room where nothing happened, but the tour guide showed us some crime scene photos. We then went into the living room where Mr. Borden's body was found. When the group entered into the living room, I felt Mr. Borden get up from the couch, but I was talking with my friends at the time, so I wasn't paying attention to where he went. While everyone was filing in, I went to go look at the small bookshelf next to the fireplace. There was a chair angled in front of the bookshelf so that it was facing the replica of the couch that Mr. Borden had died in. I could feel Mr. Borden standing behind the chair and Mrs. Borden sitting in the chair as I was looking in the bookcase, but as everyone settled into the room and sat down, I found that people were looking at me because I was leaving the chair empty. When the tour guide started talking, I sat in the chair so that I wouldn't be standing in the middle of the room. That was a massive mistake, since I sat on Mrs. Borden and I could feel Mr. Borden staring at me disapprovingly from behind the chair. I was going to stand up right away because I was seriously uncomfortable, but one of my friends decided to take a picture of me in the chair, so I had to wait until she was done to stand up and bolt across the room. Some other stuff happened in the house that day, although not directly to me. Two of the friends that I was with heard noises coming from one of the rooms in the attic when the tour stopped there and decided to go investigate. They found nothing, so they left to come tell me and my boyfriend who was with us, and when they went back into the room, there was a large shooter marble right where one of them had been standing not just 30 seconds earlier. One of them also heard footsteps following us up the stairs. On the way home, we decided to stop at Dighton Rock State Park in Berkeley, Massachusetts. Dighton Rock is a rock that they had found when they were building a dam for the Taunton River in Dighton. They dredged it up and discovered that it was covered in petroglyphs. No one has been able to identify or translate the petroglyphs, so we have no clue where they came from or who wrote them, although the theories abound and include Native Americans, ancient Phoenicians, Norse, Portuguese, and even Chinese. Dighton Rock is fairly creepy in and of itself, but what happened in the park was even creepier. Since the park was technically closed for the season, the main road was closed to auto traffic. People were parking in a little flat dirt area off to the side and walking down the mile-ish long road to the park area, so that's what we decided to do. As we walked down the road, it was really quiet. We couldn't hear any birds chirping, and even though there are small streams that run through the area connecting Shepherd's Cove and the Taunton River, we couldn't hear any water running either. Even the conversations of the people we passed seemed muffled. We passed the time by telling stories and making jokes, but we were all spooked, whether we knew it consciously or not. You could tell by our body language. We were walking close together in a line, and someone was always speaking so that we could stave off that feeling. Afterwards, we all agreed that it was creepy, but didn't want to bring it up to each other at the time. While we were walking down the road, I kept getting this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. It didn't help that the woods were strangely thick and full of thorns, and that I kept hearing rustling and movement. I also started seeing things in the woods out of the corner of my eye. I felt like we were being stalked by a predator or that something dangerous was following us. I looked into the woods at one point and could have sworn that I saw a fully transparent Native American warrior hunter stalking us through the woods. He was tall, but slightly hunched and thin. He was bare-chested and holding a bow with feathers in his hair and a quiver full of arrows on his back. I was shocked when I saw him, but he seemed to be the one who was following us. He never came any closer, and when we got to the clearing in the woods where the park was, he didn't follow us into the park. He did follow us all the way to the road until we got back to our car, though. That seriously spooked me, especially because I was the only one to see him. Unfortunately, the Dighton Rock Museum wasn't open that day, so I'll have to go back there when it's open to see it and see if I can find that spirit again.
This happened on the Halloween night of 2008, and is not my own experience, but that of my brother, sister, and close friends. It is long, so bear with me. I lived in Canberra during my childhood, and Canberra is known to be the most haunted location in Australia, given its history. Growing up, I never took the paranormal seriously. However, my sister and her 3 friends did. In fact, they were all Wiccans. On occasion, they would try and contact spirits in the closest cemetery at daytime, but would only experience slight things like really cold air or hearing footsteps. On Halloween 2008, they decided to go down to the cemetery at midnight, and my brother and his friend also went along. They were all around the age of 13 to 19. I was 14. For some stubborn and stupid reason, I decided to stay home. I now know that I will regret that decision for the rest of my life. This was definitely a very haunted place, and it is also worth mentioning that it is one of the oldest churches in Australia, being built in 1840. It is called St. John's the Baptist Church. Excitedly they walked down, but not really expecting to see anything amazing. When they reached the cemetery, it was all serious business. They sat down in a circle and held hands, with a candle in the center. Then my sister read something aloud from a book. When it ended, they were all looking around for about 10 minutes, and one of my sister's friends was the first to see something. This thing was glowing a gray color, and it seemed to be fading in and out of focus. It was 20 meters away at the side of the churchyard. They were just watching it for a few minutes, whispering to each other. Then my sister and her 3 friends started slowly walking towards it. As they got closer, it became clearer and clearer that it was a ghost of a young girl in 19th century clothing. They slowly recognized the details and folds in her dress and hair as she was twirling her arms and spinning. They just stared at the figure, silently smiling in awe. They were not threatened at all. She was not aggressive in the least. They always tell me how amazing it was, and I'm still so jealous. My brother and his friend started approaching it slowly as well by the hand gestures of the others. Next to the ghost, there was an old big tree, and they noticed the dirt around it was being flown up in the air, and they started hearing this strange, growling sort of noise, like a dying animal coming from that direction. Something started to form there. It slowly took the shape of a humanoid on all fours, and was appearing in and out of focus. The girl ghost had disappeared. For some strange reason, it seemed to be digging in the ground very frantically, almost like trying to find something that was buried under the tree. They were happy the seance worked, until now. As the two boys cautiously crept up to them before seeing what it was, the strange ghost had stopped and everything went quiet. Suddenly, it looked straight up at them and saw them as some sort of threat. With no warning, it started to crawl and float towards them very aggressively while making a screeching sound. On this path, it disappeared and then reappeared, getting closer as it did. I would imagine tears forming in their eyes as their version of reality was bending. Never a nice feeling. I told them that they should have stayed to see what it wanted. They replied by saying things like, "No way, this thing definitely wanted to hurt us. We all started feeling tremendous fear, and there was no way we would have stayed any longer." As they ran out, excited yet terrified, my brother was the only one to look back, and he said it was still chasing them, while the other girl ghost reappeared in the same spot. Well, they did not go back for months after that. The images were still too vivid. Personally, I would have gone back to check it out the same night, along with a lot of other things. When they did call Mum to pick them up, they explained everything they saw to us when they got home. At first, I did not believe them. Then I got a look at my brother's face. It was so pale white, it was almost like there was no blood in his head at all, and they all had terrified looks on their faces. When they were telling me all this, they held back tears, yet they were really excited at the same time. I had no other choice but to believe them. Often it crosses my mind that the ghost of the young girl was luring them closer to the evil-looking ghost. But why? 1 year later, they went again, and this time I went with them. It was not half as successful, though. I did, after the seance, walk around by myself for a few minutes. I felt very uneasy and threatened for no reason at that moment. I remember vividly seeing something white and ghostly float over my head for about 3 seconds. Walking away from that area, I stayed about 10 meters away from everybody else looking around the graveyard for anything interesting, but saw nothing. After about 5 minutes later, I swear I saw something unfocused that caught my eye. It was wobbling and flickering like a pale green flame. It was around the same area that the ghost of the young girl was last year. It was so captivating and hypnotic. I looked at it with a smile for about 30 seconds, then walked to the others and said, "I think there is something over there." So we walked towards it. I thought, finally, I can have this experience. But sadly, it didn't last that long. As we approached it, it slowly seemed to be different. Surprisingly, all that was there was an old, tall gravestone. Just a gravestone. We felt silly. We all stayed there for about 15 minutes and didn't see anything, only heard the odd noises from inside the church, like someone was moving heavy objects. When we walked home, everybody was saying things like, "Well, that was a dud." I felt angry and upset. To this day, I still wonder what I saw. It couldn't be just a gravestone. They don't fade in and out, glow, move, or change shape. I believe it was a ghost. Sometimes I drive down to the cemetery just to take pictures, hoping to catch something interesting. Out of the 58 I have taken, there is only one picture of a ghost. I have had more experiences, but that's for another time.
Where I'm from, everyone knows about Highway Sheila. Some people even say they knew her. She was a vibrant lady full of laughter and joy, and she was loving and caring and would never harm even an ant. Judging by the size of this town, I don't doubt that some people did know her. Her death was gruesome and tragic. Nobody knew who or why anyone would want to hurt Sheila. Her death shocked everyone. She earned her nickname from her hauntings right after her death. It's said that she was on her way home late one night when she had a flat tire on the highway. She got out of her car and waved at traffic to try and get some help. I don't think she had a cell phone at the time. Finally, Highway Sheila managed to catch the attention of one driver. He pulled in and parked right next to her vehicle. She went over to the car and saw that he had about 4 friends with him. She asked for help and explained her situation. All 4 got out. She noticed they were intoxicated. After checking her tire out, they went up to her and started acting weird, passing remarks and even touching her. She was afraid and told them she didn't need their help anymore and asked them directly to leave. That made them angry, and they started getting more aggressive and even violent. Then one of them pushed Highway Sheila into her car and began assaulting her. She screamed, but nobody heard her cries. They blocked her mouth. They all had turns with her. They cut her and made markings on her body, torturing her until she had no energy to cry or scream. Highway Sheila just laid there. They murdered that poor girl. To those sickos, it made them laugh. They didn't know they made the biggest mistakes of their lives. She came back from the dead, eager and thirsty for the blood of her murderers. She hunted them down like animals one by one and killed them in the most brutal manner possible. Many people have claimed encountering her. Apparently, she lurks the N2 highway and tampers with cars as they pass. It's said that she hitchhikes for a lift to her home. I don't know for sure what she looks like, and I haven't seen her and certainly wouldn't want to, or want anyone else to. There's a picture of a house on the highway. Look closely at the window when you see it. The guy standing there took that picture because he wanted to show his family the house. I don't think he ever went back to that house again, and I don't blame him. I don't know how much is true, but if you're on the N2 highway in South Africa, be sure to keep an eye out for Highway Sheila.
I'm a late blind. I never used to get scared of any ghost stories, and I always enjoyed catching up with any horror movie. My friends considered me lucky because I was spared from watching the horrifying scenes. I never believed in ghosts and paranormal activities, not until August 2015. We are an Anglo-Indian family, and usually it has been our custom to visit our family bungalow for any special occasion. This time it was my cousin's wedding, and a party was thrown at the bungalow. We were gathered over there, and the music was being played at full blast. As I cannot see, I was slightly getting disoriented, and I requested my cousin Elvis to take me to a quiet place where I could relax. He took me to a lawn, which was at the backyard of the bungalow. We were talking to each other when one of my aunts called out for Elvis. He told me that he would come back, and he left. I was standing there. It was quite cold, and I could vaguely hear the music from far away. Suddenly, the swing in the backyard started swaying. I was wondering who it was, and I asked if someone was there. There was no reply. I thought that the swing must have moved because of the wind. I started feeling uncomfortable after a while. It was as though someone was watching me. I started feeling very cold, and I sensed a presence standing next to me. "Darkus," that person whispered in my ears. I was frightened, because I had never heard such a strange voice ever in my life. I was demanding that person to tell me who it was, but there was no reply. I was trying to find my way out to the party area because I was terribly scared. Just then, Elvis came back to find me in a panic state. He asked me if I was okay, and I questioned him if anyone else was there around me. He told me that there was no one except for me and him. I requested him to take me away from there, and I didn't speak a word after that. Even after that date, that experience gives me a chill in my spine. I can't forget it. I'm not sure if it was a paranormal presence or my cousin's prank on me. But whatever it was scary. I haven't shared it with anyone in my family because I am sure that they will not believe me.
This is a story about my friend Tim. I didn't know it then, but the same ghost that was visiting me was also haunting a complete stranger that I would eventually meet. This ghost was so persistent it actually changed the paths of our lives. It started with a dream for Tim, a ghost taunting him about things that happened to him that seemed so real he actually started to believe it himself, even though he had no genuine recollection of it. This was one of his first experiences with a visit from the ghost in his dreams. He found himself standing in the woods in the middle of a dense fog. It was misting to the point of almost raining. He blew in his hands to warm them and noticed he could see his breath when he exhaled. His feet were cold, and he looked down at them and noticed he didn't have the heavy insulated boots he normally wore when he was hiking, but instead a rather thin pair of tall leather boots. He stared at them, feeling a bit confused. They were not his boots, but yet he recognized them. He stomped his feet a few times to get some circulation going. His legs were sore as though he had been hiking for a very long time or had stood still for too long and they had fallen asleep. He looked around to himself to try to figure out where he was. Night was beginning to fall and the darkness mixed with the fog made it very difficult to distinguish his surroundings. He picked a direction and proceeded to begin making his way through the woods, squinting in the dark trying to make out his surroundings. He felt like he had to urinate, so he walked up to a tree and reached down to unzip his fly. He felt for the metal fastener and realized that there was no zipper. Instead, he found very large, clumsy buttons. He managed to undo them enough so he could relieve himself, and then had terrible time closing them back up with his fingers being so cold. All he saw around him was the shadows of tremendous dark trees in the fog. He found he had no choice but to continue on, trying to maintain a straight path, thinking sooner or later he would have to walk out of the woods. He stopped and listened momentarily to see if he could hear anything or anyone around him, but there was only total silence that fell on his ears. He continued on hearing only his breathing and the sounds of his feet on the dead leaves and twigs snapping beneath the weight of his boots. Suddenly, very far off in the distance, he thought he heard a voice call out. He stopped suddenly in mid-stride and carefully listened. Again, there was only complete silence. He took another step and then heard something once again. It was very faint and far away, but definitely a voice calling out. "Who's there?" He called out in the darkness. No one answered him. He continued to stand silent, allowing his ears to pick up the slightest sound or movement. Again, he strained his eyes to pick up anything moving anywhere around him. Turning a full circle, he checked all directions. In front of him, he could barely just make out a very faint light flickering very far off in front of him. The moment he noticed the light, he again heard a voice from the same direction. He aimed himself towards the light and set out in the direction of it, taking long strides while keeping focused on it so as not to lose sight of it, and he felt completely lost. He knew it was very important not to lose sight of that flickering light. He traveled towards it as quickly as he was able to, traveling through the thick underbrush and fallen branches, tripping and falling several times on the cold, wet ground. His palms were scratched and bleeding from trying to soften his falls whenever he tripped, but even so he could barely feel the pain from the cold. The light was growing slightly larger, but it was an odd sort of light, not steady like a flashlight would be, but instead flickered like a flame would when a fire was lit in the dark. He called out several times, but no one replied. The only sound he could hear was the loud thundering of his own heart beating from the exertion of traveling so quickly through the woods and his own heavy breathing. He felt as though he had traveled for miles and hours, but yet the light seemed to grow further away from him instead of closer. Exhausted now, he knew he would have to stop for a bit. He backed up against a large tree, being very careful as to never take his eyes away from the light, now so very far off in the distance. He laid his back against it and slowly slid down into a squatting position against its trunk. He was trying to take some of the weight off his aching legs and feet. He leaned there trying to slow his heartbeat down by drawing in long, deep breaths and letting them back out very slowly, trying to allow his lungs to absorb as much oxygen as possible. It didn't seem to be working. He felt as though he was being suffocated very slowly. It was almost as if though somebody was choking the air off at his windpipe with their hands. He began to realize that he was approaching unconsciousness as his legs gave way from under him and he fell to the ground hard on his buttocks. The only thing keeping him upright was the huge tree trunk he had been leaning on. His eyes seemed to be losing focus as he continued to struggle to focus on the flickering light. The trees, already distorted in the fog, were beginning to waver as though he were looking at them through water. His head was pounding in unison to his own heartbeat. The flickering light began to diminish to a mere speck and was almost completely gone now. He reached his hand out as though he were trying to grab it and hold on to it to prevent it from disappearing from his sight completely. "Please," he mumbled. "Please don't leave me here alone." He felt drool drip in long strings from the corner of his mouth as he spoke and run down his neck. It felt as though his blood was trapped in his head, causing his face to swell and bruise from the pressure. His eyelids felt as though they were also beginning to swell over his eyes so severely he had but a sliver of vision remaining through them, left now with nothing than mere slits to see through. He reached down and tried to rub his legs, but he could not even feel his own hands on his flesh. They were cold and stiff to his touch. He felt tremendous fear. He knew he was fading from consciousness, and he even thought that perhaps it was time for him to pass from here, and he had given in to the thought. He raised his eyes one last time towards the direction where the flickering light had been, and suddenly there it was, directly before him, huge and overwhelming like a great fire. The light now so bright it burned his eyes, and the heat of it so intense his face felt as though the flesh were melting from it. A small bit of the flame fell from the mass and landed on something lying in the grass near him. It almost looked like a belt or a strap to him. It ignited from the flame and began to burn, following its length towards him, climbing up his chest and within inches of his neck. He patted on it desperately and felt above the flame. He realized that the strap was wrapped around his neck. He pulled at it, desperately trying to pull it away from him, but it seemed to be buried in the very flesh of his neck. "Someone please help me," he called out in the darkness. Suddenly the pressure from his neck was gone, and he could feel air fill his lungs once again. The fire disappeared simultaneously, but now there was a figure standing before him. As his vision cleared, he realized it was a woman. She was standing in front of him with her head oddly cocked to one side. "You must do what I say." He heard her words in his head. That was when he woke. He went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. When he leaned forward to dry his face, he noticed a mark on his neck. It almost looked like a tiny part of a rope burn. I too found myself standing alone on a long, narrow gravel road. It was very dark. There was a damp gray mist rolling along the ditches, almost appearing as though it were a gray ghost lurking against the total blackness that had enveloped me. I could see, despite the darkness, that tremendous trees lined both sides of the road beside me. They had no leaves. Their branches were very long and black, blacker than the darkness it was itself. They stretched out over the roads from both sides, as though they were trying to touch each other above me, but then had somehow become snarled and twisted at their spiny tips, now interlocked and tangled, They formed a tunnel effect above me and around me. Despite the heavy mist and the darkness, I could still see clearly down the road before me and far off into the distance. There, a pinpoint of light, I observed a shadow-like figure that appeared to be moving towards me. Even though I was deep in sleep, I could actually smell the dampness of the air and the aroma of the wet, rotting bark of the huge black trees. I felt fear beginning to flow through me, clenching my body, paralyzing my legs and feet, causing me to be unable to move them. I felt as though I was standing in hardened cement. The figure continued to move slowly and deliberately towards me, making short, jerky movements with every step it took. It seemed to take endless hours for it to reach me. I watched as it moved closer and closer. With no way for me to flee, I could only observe and wait. Now, finally but a few yards from me, the figure abruptly stopped and stood completely motionless directly in front of me. The fog was now so dense I felt as though I was looking through a very thick, dirty glass that distorted the face and made it near impossible for me to make out any distinct features. I could feel the cold, heavy air weighing on my skin. I glanced down to my forearm and observed that the dampness of the mist had formed a few tiny little beads of liquid on it. I watched as they suddenly gathered together to form one big water droplet that tickled me as it trickled off my skin and toppled to the ground in slow motion. I had a sudden flashback of memory before my eyes. I saw the tears landing on top of the grease in my bowl of soup the night I learned of my mother's impending death. I lifted my eyes back up to the figure, startled that it was now but a few inches from me. The mist had thinned enough to clearly see the features of the face. It was a woman. She was looking at me in a very odd sort of way. She spoke to me, but her lips were not moving. It was as though I heard her with my mind. "It's time for you to change." That was all I heard. I found myself sitting up in my bed. The dream had sent chills down my arms. I reached to rub them and found them to be damp to the touch. This started many events that deeply affected mine and Tim's life. It was a scary time for both of us, but eventually we found out what the ghost was really after. They haunt you for a reason. There is something that they want from you, and sometimes you eventually find out what that is.
The soft thud of following footsteps echoed behind him as he hurried through the snowflakes toward home. They kept pace with him, quickening when he quickened, and slowing when he slowed. His flesh crawled at the sound, and he sped up, cursing himself for walking home alone from the midnight Christmas Mass. Normally not a pious man, the middle-aged bachelor had suddenly been struck by a wish to hear the old Christmas song sung once again by a church choir, and had walked across town to attend the service. Now he regretted his choice, as he passed dark house after dark house in the snowy night, and the footsteps ever followed. He sped up until he was nearly running, and skidded into his street. A few more paces brought him to the bottom of his front steps, and as he dashed up them, he realized suddenly that the following footsteps had ceased abruptly. He glanced behind him at the cross street from which he had just turned, and saw only one pair of footprints in the snow-covered street, when there should have been two. He frowned in puzzlement, and then shuddered as a cold breeze struck him, driving snow against his collar, and slammed against the door. Almost it seemed to pass through the door, but that was superstitious nonsense. His hand was shaking as he unlocked the front door and hurried inside. He expected darkness, but was delighted to see the yellow glow of firelight coming from his study doorway upstairs. His old housekeeper, whom he thought firmly asleep in her attic bedroom, must have lit the fire pending his return. He struggled out of his coat and paused for a moment, amazed to find it still warm and dry, though he had walked for more than a mile through a snowstorm. It was almost as if he had been walking in a bubble of calm air, though he remembered the soft snowflakes hitting his face when he first stepped out of church, before the mysterious footsteps began. His shudder was interrupted by a shout of greeting as his old friend Andy came hurrying out of the study. His whole face lit up in a grin at the unexpected surprise. The two men shook hands heartily and retreated back to the warmth of the firelight, talking so fast they stumbled over each other's words. Andy had left town years ago to take a government job in D.C., and they hadn't seen each other since. Nearly an hour passed before it occurred to him that his guest might be hungry. His offer of a meal was instantly accepted, but Andy was unwilling to leave the comfort of the fire to eat in the kitchen, so he jogged downstairs alone to fetch some food. He didn't wonder at his friend's reluctance to join him in the kitchen. Andy had looked very pale and had kept shivering with cold while they talked. He hoped his friend wasn't ailing for anything. A few moments later, he was back with warmed-up meat and potatoes and a couple glasses of beer, apologizing profusely as he handed Andy a plate for the mismatched dinnerware. Andy just laughed and hunkered down to eat. When they were both finished, he showed his friend to a guest room and then tumbled into his own bed to sleep. All his apprehension caused by mysterious footsteps forgotten in the visit of his friend. He jumped out of bed Christmas morning and dashed immediately downstairs to the guest room to rouse his friend. Andy wasn't there, and the bed had not been slept in. That was odd. He ran down to look in the study, but Andy wasn't there either, and one plate full of food was sitting on the end table beside his old friend's chair. It was completely untouched, though he'd seen Andy eating from it the night before. Skin creeping at the thought, he ran to the kitchen and asked his housekeeper if she'd seen Andy, but the housekeeper had seen no one either the previous night or this morning. He flopped down on the bottom step of the staircase, completely baffled. Where had Andy gone? It was a mystery that plagued him all Christmas Day, and he did not enjoy his holiday dinner at all, a fact that annoyed his housekeeper. He was awakened the next morning from a restless sleep by the sound of the front doorbell. He stumbled out of bed and was splashing water from the bedside pitcher onto his sleepy eyes when a knock came at his bedroom door. When he answered, his housekeeper handed him a telegram that had just arrived. As she hurried back downstairs to prepare his breakfast, he opened it curiously, not knowing who would be telegraphing him so urgently. As he read the telegram, he started to tremble. The message was short and to the point. Andy's family regretted to inform him that his old friend Andy had passed away on Christmas Eve in his home in Washington, D.C. He sat down hard on the bed, the telegram fluttering away from his hand. It must have been Andy who had followed him home on Christmas Eve. That would explain the eerie footsteps and the dry coat in the middle of the snowstorm. He'd spent Christmas Eve with a ghost.
When I was growing up, we didn't know about the dangers of a Ouija board. In fact, it was often left as a Christmas gift under the tree. We played with it some back then, but I never thought much of it really. Just figured others were moving it, to be honest. In fact, it wasn't until I was 17 that I witnessed proof. To me anyways, that there was more to this board than originally had believed. My first ex-wife, girlfriend then, were at a party at a friend's house. We were sitting around hitting a pipe with the group. Hey, it was the 80s, when the subject of the Ouija came up. My friend's older brother was talking about it. I was like, dude, that thing's just a bunch of bullcrap. He was like, oh man, it really works. You just have to learn to use it correctly and give it some time. He asked if I wanted to play, and I said no. My ex, on the other hand, was enthused, so he brought out the board, set it up, and they began. I'll never forget that night. I was sitting across the room watching the two of them play. They were asking questions, getting yes or no answers, and I was thinking, what a con. So I started thinking to myself, okay, is this thing really working? Mind you, I'm across the room, nowhere near this board. I start repeating a question over and over in my head. No one knows I'm doing this. I keep repeating in my thoughts, what's Tanya's middle name? And the board starts going really fast in a figure 8. I hear her ask him what's going on. He's like, I don't know. In the meantime, I'm repeating my question in my head over and over again. It stops, and I hear her say A. Then it starts again. Then I hear him say N. And this continues. N-E-T-T-E. Then the Ouija goes back to normal speed. He says, Annette, what's that about? She lets go of the Ouija with her eyes so wide open that they look like they are going to pop out, and then she says, that's my middle name. I was like, huh, I guess it's not Bull. He looks across the room at me and asks, dude, were you asking that? I just smiled and said yes. Well, needless to say, she was through playing with the Ouija that night. Well, me being me, that really sparked my interest. So for a while, I started experimenting with the Ouija by doing sessions. It surprised me, but it really seemed to be working. I noticed though that just about every time we would sit and use this thing, it would increase with intensity. We would always start out talking with one spirit, but then others would come through and take over the board. This one in particular would come through by the name of AJ. Through time, we learned he was a young boy who had drowned. Honestly, we came to think of him as a friend. But then after a few months, his responses became more vulgar in nature. Sometimes outright hostile. We would start getting onto him, threatening to end the session and not return again if he didn't stop. Then the board would start going lightning fast, and it trailed to the letters Z-O-Z-O. This would keep repeating until we decided that AJ was throwing a fit. We would say goodbye and put the board away and then go on about our day. Well, we were tired of it, to be honest. It seemed like every time that we would get on it, AJ would take over and not let us communicate with anyone else. So we finally just quit messing with it altogether. Then through the years, we learned of the dangers of the board and decided, good riddance. Now this is where the story became worth telling. Just a couple of years ago, I learned of a paranormal investigator's research into a worldwide phenomenon known as Zozo. Z-O-Z-O or Zozo is a spirit or demon, and I'm fairly certain has been linked to murders and suicides throughout the world. He comes to Ouija sessions and begins working on the mental stability of its users, searching, I think, for vulnerable victims. Now granted, we didn't fall into his game to that point, thank God. But I think it's important for anyone that's thinking of using a Ouija board to be aware of this thing's presence.
He had just graduated from Harvard University and was living in Manhattan. He loved the city and was beginning to feel at home on its streets. World War II was raging in Europe, and like all other good citizens, he followed the headlines daily and did his part for the boys overseas. Hugging his jacket close, he stood shivering at the corner, waiting for the light to change and wondering where his enlisted friends might be staying on that cold winter night. He hoped they were safe. He shivered, only partially from the cold, and looked around him at the bright lights of Times Square. He never tired of this glittering scene. His eye was caught by two men who were dressed in the uniforms of the Royal Air Force of England. They must be on leave, he thought. The men stopped beside him, glanced quickly at their watches, and then nodded and grinned at him. The taller of the two asked him, in the clipped accent of the British, if this was Times Square. He suppressed a smile at such a touristy question, and said that it was. The light changed, and the two RAF pilots fell into step with the Harvard graduate as he crossed the street. The three men fell into conversation together as they meandered along the shining streets. The Brits were thrilled to be in Times Square after all they had suffered in the war. They didn't go into detail about their wartime experiences, and he didn't press them. He just enjoyed their pleasure in the scene, which was marred only by the frequent checking of their watches. Finally, he asked if they had someplace to be. He promptly invited them to have dinner with him at the Harvard Club, and the RAF pilots accepted with alacrity. The three men repaired immediately to the Harvard Club, where they dined leisurely and chatted late into the evening. The RAF pilots were good company and told many stories, although they glossed over their experiences in the war. They continued to check their watches frequently throughout the night, but he decided it was just a nervous habit they had picked up somewhere, possibly in the Air Force. As midnight approached, the two RAF pilots excused themselves and rose from the table. They thanked the Harvard man for a memorable evening and started for the door. Then the tall pilot turned back and told their host that they had always wanted to visit Times Square, but never had the opportunity. It was strange, the pilot added, that they had to wait until after they were dead, killed in action when their planes were shot down the night before.